All right, everybody. This is going to be a video walking you through Aristotle's Posterior Analytics. This book is tough to understand. For a very long time, even after I started teaching it, I didn't understand what was happening in large parts of this book. Or rather, I didn't understand what Aristotle was saying. So the way I would figure out what Aristotle meant was by going to find an article about what Aristotle's beliefs were on some issue, written by somebody, within the last 50 years, not Aristotle directly, because Aristotle's prose is just amazingly difficult to understand. So here's the situation, or here's the situation we're in. I am assigning you this translation. Why? Because it's free. Translated by somebody named G.R.G. Muir. It's free because it's old. It's an old translation. It's also a really bad translation in a lot of ways. A lot of things don't make sense. In some ways, the problem is some things make too much sense. So, for example, here's a better translation. This is a more accurate translation of this book than the one I gave you. The first sentence says, all teaching and all learning of an intellectual kind proceed from pre-existent knowledge. The translation I gave you said, all instruction given or received by way of argument proceeds from pre-existent knowledge. As you can tell, there's a big difference there. The translator here, in an attempt to make the prose a little easier to understand, is just really falsifying what Aristotle actually says. It's not just learning or instruction that happens by argument. It's any intellectual learning. Now, a lot of these differences won't make a difference for us at the level we're doing it. I just want to make you aware of this, that we're dealing with a substandard translation, and the only reason we're doing it is because it's free. I didn't want to make you buy a copy of Aristotle's collected works, given that I'm only going to teach you things from a little bit of it. So let's work through the parts of book one that I've assigned. This video won't be able to get through everything that I assigned from book one, but it'll be able to get through chapter one at least, maybe chapter two. We'll see how long it goes. Okay, so chapter one. Let's take a look at this first paragraph here, see what he's saying. So he says, all instruction given or received by way of argument proceeds from pre-existent knowledge. This might remind you of Plato. It might remind you of Plato's response to Meno's paradox. And remember that Plato thought we were born with information, or rather, we were born with true opinion about the definitions of concepts in our souls. And that the Socratic method sort of calls this true opinion forth, and through repeated use of the Socratic method, the true opinion turns into knowledge when you start to understand the connections between concepts. A process that mainly happens by clearing away bad definitions that you've accepted, or even clearing away belief in concepts that aren't real concepts, or that don't correspond to any real divisions in nature. That's Plato's idea. And it might sound like Aristotle's saying the same thing. Now, there is a difference right off the bat in that Aristotle's talking about pre-existent knowledge, and Plato doesn't say you have innate knowledge. He's quite clear about that in the Phaedo, but even in the Meno, if you take a look at that dialogue as a whole, it's very clear that it can't be innate knowledge, because if you have knowledge, you're able to give an account of what you know, and we clearly can't give an account of what we know right from birth. So there's that problem. But the other issue is that, as you look at this translation, all instruction given or received by way of argument, and in the other better translation, the one I can't just give to you because it's still under copyright, all teaching and all learning of an intellectual kind proceed from pre-existent knowledge. He's not saying all learning does that. If he was saying all learning does that, he would be maybe closer to Plato's position. But what's going to happen here is Aristotle's going to tell us that there's other kinds of learning besides intellectual learning, or as in this translation, instruction by way of argument. So he basically just goes through examples of different kinds of instruction by argument and shows that anytime you have an argument, anytime you have intellectual learning, you have to take certain things for granted, right? When you're making an argument, there's premises. There's things you're assuming, and that then you perform the deduction on, right? You apply the rules of deductive logic, which Aristotle developed, to those premises to get the conclusion, right? That's all he's saying here. The contrast is going to be what's interesting, and that's really what's going to make the posterior analytics important. The contrast with intellectual learning and the role that this other kind of learning, which he won't tell us about until literally the very end of the book, the contrast with this other kind of learning between that and intellectual learning is going to make the whole difference to Aristotle's epistemological theory. And it's going to end up with Aristotle having a tremendously different epistemological theory than Plato had. All right, moving on. Aristotle says the pre-existent knowledge that you have is of two kinds. In some cases, admission of the fact must be assumed. In others, comprehension of the meaning of the term used. And sometimes both assumptions are essential. Now, all that Aristotle is pointing out here is that before you can understand an argument, for one thing, and this is probably the clearer example, you have to know what the terms of the argument mean. You have to know what the words mean, right? The example he gives, and it's an example that we're going to come back to, involves triangle, like knowing what the word triangle means. Right, so as an example, what the word triangle means. You're not going to be able to do anything with an argument about triangles if you don't know what the word means. As far as knowledge of propositions, the example he uses is sometimes called the law of excluded middle. The way he puts it is every property is true of an object or not, right? So take any object you want, like here's a can of soda. There's, for every property you can imagine, it's either true of this can or not. Is this can three-dimensional? Yes, that property is true of this can. Is this can furry? I sure hope not, right? Doesn't look so on the outside. If there's fur on the inside of this, it's going to be a nasty surprise. For every property, it's going to be true or false of the can. Aristotle thinks that's something you have to know. That's a proposition you have to know the truth of before you understand any argument. I presume that example was used because Aristotle thinks that principle is sort of presupposed in any logical deduction. He thinks of it as a basic rule of logic. There's much more debate about that now than there was in Aristotle's time. But hopefully at this point, we're still following along with what he's saying pretty well. Next up is a point that, and here it really just gets confusing. In fact, for the rest of book one, from this point on here, recognition of the truth, all the way through the end of book one, it's a mystery. And I spent years not understanding what the hell was going on in this passage. It's only actually fairly recently that I figured out what was going on, and not through my own efforts either. It's not like I looked at this text and pondered it and eventually figured it out. What I did is I went to a commentary. With ancient texts, there's always a commentary, or almost always a commentary, almost always like many commentaries on it, where someone takes the text and goes line by line and talks about all the different issues that come up in those lines. This is a commentary on Aristotle's Posterior Analytics. It is a 324-page long document, and the Posterior Analytics is only the first third of it, which means the commentary is twice as long as the text itself. And I'm going to get my understanding of what's going on in this passage from this commentary among a couple of others. Okay, so let's go back to the text that I gave you. So he says recognition of truth may in some cases contain as factors both previous knowledge and also knowledge acquired simultaneously with that recognition. And he uses an example involving a triangle. Now I'm going to skip going through line by line what's going on with this example and I'm just going to talk about it in a more straightforward way using the whiteboard, or in this case, Blackboard program. So Aristotle is going to use an example. And this example is going to go through the rest of chapter 1, in which you got a circle and you have a triangle inscribed on that circle. But the idea is you don't necessarily know it's a triangle. You don't know it just by looking at it. So Aristotle wants to ask a question about, or he wants to make a point about you coming to know the following claim. Let's give this figure a name. Let's call this figure T. Right? So the circle has a figure T inside it. Now let's ask the question, or let's talk about the proposition T has 180 degree internal angles. The internal angles of T add up to 180 degrees. Anyway, right? So Aristotle wants to talk about you coming to know this, right? So you're shown this drawing, and you come to the conclusion that the figure T has 180 degree internal angles, right? And what he says is some knowledge is pre-existing. And the example of the pre-existing knowledge, so we'll call it pre-existing knowledge, is all triangles have 180 degrees internal angles. And then he says, but in addition to pre-existing knowledge, there's also knowledge you gain at the same time as, right? The conclusion. So this is the conclusion. You draw a conclusion. You look at this figure and you draw the conclusion. The figure T has 180 degree internal angles, or internal angles adding up to 180 degrees. You also get simultaneous knowledge that T is a triangle. Here's what Aristotle thinks. You come into the situation knowing that all triangles have internal angles adding up to 180 degrees. And you come to the conclusion that the figure T inside the circle has internal angles adding up to 180 degrees. And you, at the same time that you draw this conclusion, draw this conclusion. But in a sense, this conclusion that T is a triangle is in some sense prior to the conclusion that T has internal angles adding up to 180 degrees, because it's through the recognition of T that you can have the understanding that, or through the recognition that T is a triangle, that you can come to have the understanding that T has internal angles adding up to 180 degrees. Okay. And you do this, Aristotle says, like immediately. You don't use an argument. He makes the point of saying, that it doesn't go through the middle term, right? For some things, the singulars finally reached were not predictable of anything else, are only learnt in this way, i.e. there is no recognition through a middle of a minor term as subject to a major. What he's basically pointing out there, something you would know from the logic video I made, is that you're not coming to understand, see here, the conclusion, through a syllogism. Because remember, it's a syllogism that has major and minor middle terms. Okay. So he's got this point about pre-existing knowledge. In some sense, both of these are pre-existing. This knowledge, the general knowledge about all triangles having 180 degree internal angles, that's something you know prior, like in time, as well as prior logically. Whereas this one that's simultaneous, you don't know it prior in time. As soon as your mind realizes that, oh, that's a triangle in there, you, at the very same time as that, come to know that that figure has internal angles adding up to 180 degrees. It's not prior in time because it's simultaneous, but it's prior logically. This is how you know that T is a triangle, is how you know that T has internal angles adding up to 180 degrees. Okay, so far, so good. Not that difficult, right? Okay, to explain what's going on in the part of chapter 1 where Aristotle claims he's getting around Meno's paradox, I'm going to explain to you the following way. Suppose the following three things are true. A, Chuck knows that all triangles have internal angles adding up to 180 degrees. B, X is a triangle. Don't worry about what X is. C, Chuck doesn't know that X is a triangle. Okay, so we've got those three things out there. Now here's a question. Does Chuck know D, where D is a new claim, that X has internal angles adding up to 180 degrees? Well, in one way, it can seem like, yeah, of course he does. After all, X is a triangle, and Chuck knows that all triangles have internal angles adding up to 180 degrees. Right? So since X is a triangle, Chuck would know that it has internal angles adding up to 180 degrees. But, of course, C is also true. Chuck doesn't know that X is a triangle. So it seems like, well, how would Chuck know that X has internal angles adding up to 180 degrees then? What's going on here is that there are two different ways of reading A. So A1, Chuck knows of each and every triangle that it has internal angles adding up to 180 degrees. That's one thing you could mean by saying A. Or A2, Chuck knows that if something is a triangle, then it has internal angles adding up to 180 degrees. These two statements look superficially similar, but they're actually importantly different. And one of the good things about Aristotle, once you work your way through him and figure out like what the hell he's saying, is that he actually pays really close attention to these slight differences in how you express what are two fundamentally very different propositions. So a close attention to language is one of the hallmarks of philosophy, because the idea is if you speak imprecisely, if you speak loosely, or if you write imprecisely or write loosely, you can lead yourself into puzzles. Right? So the idea is, with A stated the way it is, you could think either that A1 is what's meant or that A2 is what's meant. But these two readings of A, these two understandings of A, lead to very different conclusions. And running them together in your mind is what can lead to the puzzle produced by asking the question, does Chuck know that X has internal angles adding up to 180 degrees? Why? Well, because if Chuck knows of each and every triangle that it has internal angles adding up to 180 degrees, then Chuck knows that about X. That's just straightforwardly implied, right? Because X is a triangle. However, if what Chuck knows is that only the claim that if something is a triangle, then it has internal angles adding up to 180 degrees, then the fact that Chuck doesn't know that X is a triangle means that, well, of course he doesn't know that X has internal angles adding up to 180 degrees. You can read A in two different ways, and those different ways will lead to different answers to one and the same question. Now, how does this help with Meno's paradox? Well, the way it helps with Meno's paradox is that Aristotle understands the difference between A1 and A2 the following way. A2 is, as he says, known universally. Another way to think of it is A2 is a universal claim. It's something that Chuck knows about the universal, the type of thing, triangles. Right? So Chuck knows something about the type of things that triangles are, so that he knows that if anything is a triangle, it has this feature, the feature of having internal angles adding up to 180 degrees. Whereas A1 superficially looks the same, but A1 is actually best understood as attributing to Chuck a whole bunch of particular knowledge. Right? Let's pretend that there were only three triangles in the universe, just to keep this example simple: X, Y, and Z. A1 says that Chuck knows of Z that it has internal angles adding up to 180 degrees, and of Y that it has internal angles adding up to 180 degrees, and of X that it has internal angles adding up to 180 degrees. That's what A1 says. He knows of each and every triangle, in particular, every particular triangle, that it has internal angles adding up to 180 degrees. A1 attributes particular knowledge to Chuck, and A2 attributes universal knowledge to Chuck. Knowledge about particular things versus knowledge about universals. Right? To put it in Platonic terminology, A1 attributes knowledge of particular things, and A2 attributes knowledge of the forms. Okay. What it's going to turn out is true is that this difference between particular knowledge and universal knowledge, or knowledge of universals versus knowledge of particulars, is going to be the key to Aristotle's solution to Meno's paradox, a solution that's very different than Plato's. Aristotle is going to end up saying, no, there's no innate true opinion. There's no innate opinions of any kind. And certainly there's no innate opinions of things like math. Right? It's not plausible. And explaining how this is possible is going to be, but none, or sorry, so he says there's no innate true opinion, which means Plato's solution to Meno's paradox is out. And Aristotle has to give a different solution. And explaining this different solution is going to basically, in a sense, be the project of the entire posterior analytics. One way to see that is that this issue, the difference between particular knowledge and universal knowledge, comes up in chapter 1. And it's going to come up in the last chapter of the book, chapter 19 of book 2. And all the rest of what goes on in between it is about building up to chapter 2. The solution, the full-on solution to Meno's paradox that Aristotle is going to give doesn't show up until the end of the book, until the final chapter. But so far, in book 1, all we have is the claim that it's the distinction between particular knowledge and universal knowledge that's going to make all the difference. I'm going to explain the solution to Meno's paradox that Aristotle gives, but I'm not going to do it in this video. The subsequent videos about the posterior analytics will go through not only this big picture issue, but also some other interesting things that Aristotle says, particularly about the nature of necessity and the connection between knowledge and necessity. But that is something you're just going to have to wait for.